Everyone. All right, so today we are starting off with Hannah Arendt's On Violence. And we're going to look at part one today. So, in reading this text, I felt like it was a little bit more all over the place than I remembered. But I think it touches on a number of important things and bigger themes that will be useful to think about. Uh, so just a little bit of background on Arendt. Hannah Arendt was born in Germany. Her dates are 1906 to 1975. And she was a German Jew and philosophy student of many prominent philosophers, most notably Martin Heidegger. But Arendt came into her own primarily as a political philosopher, and especially as a political philosopher of Nazism and totalitarianism. She was arrested in Nazi Germany for doing research into anti-Semitism and fled Nazi Germany for France until France was occupied by the Nazis, and she fled to the United States and lived in New York for the rest of her life, teaching philosophy and writing for a number of popular New York magazines, American magazines. She was a public intellectual, right? That was sort of her calling card. She was the kind of philosopher that would write in popular journals to talk about contemporary states of affairs. And that's a lot of what this text on violence is about. So as we're reading it, I think it'll be useful to put it in the context of totalitarianism and Arendt's experience in Nazi Germany and in World War II Europe. It's written at the end of her life. The text was published in 1970, so 5 years before her death. But it's a very interesting document about the late 60s and the early 70s, and in particular about, I think, the relationship between youth movements, which she calls the New Left, and this would have been the sort of collection of movements in the 60s and 70s that were, aimed at various left agendas. So that would include the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, the Black Power movement, and various other actions and movements along those lines. So I think it's interesting. I generally think it's interesting to study the late 60s and early 70s as a point of comparison for thinking about the United States today. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, is how much more violent the movements in the 60s and 70s could be. In particular, this is true in the very late 60s and early 70s. The other thing that's interesting, and this is sort of the connection I think Arendt is working on, is the fact that these movements were happening sort of right on the cusp of technologization and well, a whole host of tendencies that are associated with what's called late capitalism. And Arendt actually uses that term, late capitalism, in a sort of mocking way. But the late 60s, in addition to seeing the birth of home computing in the 70s, really. But we are also the sort of moment where global capitalism um, takes a new form, and this is going to be made possible largely by decolonization. And decolonization in the 1950s and 60s saw the liberation of countries in Africa, Asia, and South America, but especially Africa and Asia, um, where colonial powers withdrew, and right, these post-colonial nation states are born, and um, the response uh, from Europe and the United States was to right establish economic relationships with these post-colonial countries, and those economic relationships will be the foundation for global capitalism. So, uh, in thinking about the left movements, the civil rights movement and the movement against the Vietnam War, uh, we can compare those to today, absolutely, but we have to think about the ways the larger world is different. And Arendt, I think, is thinking about these trends, globalization, technologization, which are so dominant in our world today, but are just getting started in the late 60s, early 70s. And so when we're thinking about the difference between, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement or Occupy Wall Street or, other sort of modern day socialism or communism or even fascism, um, one of the main things that's going to make the strategies of those movements different is going to be this development of globalization and technologization. Um, and so, with that as sort of background thought, what is Arendt's interest here? As I said, this text is a little bit more disorganized than I remembered it being. Uh, it's a bit of a rant. But Arendt's interest in this text and in the rest of her work uh, is really focused on freedom, on human freedom, and on the conditions that are needed to foster and allow for human freedom. For Arendt, uh, freedom is not a metaphysical problem as it is for some other philosophers. Freedom is strictly a political problem. Uh, as a being, your freedom is not restricted by the laws of physics or by God. Your freedom can only be restricted by political bodies, right? By laws, by a state. Uh, and because for Arendt, freedom is the highest sort of form of humanity, right? Free action is for Arendt uh, the pinnacle of human behavior. And the point of politics for Arendt is to maximize human freedom, opportunities for human freedom, and encourage free action. Uh, so Arendt is thinking about freedom, the conditions that make freedom possible in the political realm, and she's thinking about this in relation to violence. So to continue a kind of schematic reading of this section before getting into the details a little bit more, uh, let's say that what Arendt is interested in when it comes to violence is the way in which violence is understood as a kind of accident and interruption of the normal functioning of the world, right? Um, Violence is viewed as an aberration, right? It's something that is not uh, sort of in the first analysis in 20th century America, not understood as um, part of the political plan, not part of uh, the sort of necessary work of a political movement, but instead as, again, a kind of aberration, a kind of accidental byproduct of political turmoil. Violence is an accident. Violence is uh, spontaneous, unpredictable, uncontrollable, uh, and so on. In that sense, violence is viewed as uh, as something in opposition to the normal operation of a state, normal operation of a world. Violence interrupts the world. But in this general understanding, violence does not have any real consequences for the world, right? It's an aberration, meaning it crops up as an accidental byproduct, but violence doesn't have the power to fundamentally change uh, the world as it is, right? This is sort of how we think about um, mass shootings, right? Uh, Mass shootings are, in one narrative, a kind of horrible byproduct of gun ownership, but we can't really say what causes them. We can't let those, aberrant explosions of violence change the way that we go about our daily life, right? Um, Mass shootings are aberrations that don't have a root cause and don't lead to any ultimate consequence. Right? This is more or less the way we discuss mass shootings in our politics. Now, right? Some people will say, well, obviously, mass shootings are caused by gun ownership. You can't have a mass shooting if you don't own a gun, um, and that's certainly true. Uh, with these outbursts of violence, right, in which the gun is the implement of violence. Um, the gun is a means to an end. And we'd be, I think, hard pressed to say that the gun itself causes the outburst of violence. It certainly makes the violence worse. But, right, if we're looking for the causes of that violence, gun ownership is only part of the question, part of the answer. But the point more broadly is the way we think about violence as this aberrant, uh, basically spontaneous, uncaused, and consequenceless. And by consequenceless, I mean um, there are no consequences for the larger system, the larger world. uh, we could think, the same thing roughly is said about police violence, or is often said by many about police violence, right? The violence against unarmed Black people is an aberration. It's a couple bad apples, and we can't look for an explanation. It's spontaneous. It just happens sometimes. Right? Violence interrupts the normal flow of things. Violence interrupts the world, but violence, in some sense, can't be traced back to a cause in the world and doesn't have consequences for the world itself. Now, why do we think of violence this way, to the extent that we do, right? And I don't mean to say that everyone thinks of violence this way, but it's a common way to think about violence. Um, and one of the ways that violence gets understood this way is um, through the sort of totalization of a world picture or the totalization of the world. The idea that the world is running according to some plan, uh, that the world is developing according to necessary processes, whether those be political processes, uh, larger historical processes, or more sort of individually based psychological processes. Right? We say the world has a sort of fixed program, and it is continuing on that program regardless of these violent, spontaneous outbreaks. And this idea that the world progresses according to its own logic, uh, that the world program will continue regardless of violent outbreaks, is, I think, the main thing that Arendt wants to call attention to and be critical of in this first section of On Violence. And so she begins um, on page 3 by talking about nuclear weapons, right? And more generally about the technical development of the implements of violence. She writes, the technical developments of the implements of violence has now reached the point where no political goal could conceivably correspond to their destructive potential or justify their actual use. She has in mind here nuclear weapons, right? Uh, but nuclear weapons are a good stand-in for technologization in general, and even more broadly, for the reign of science and technology within society in general. So let's read a little bit more. This is on page 4. How is it that nuclear weapons reaffirm this world picture and the idea that the world is moving according to a set plan that ultimately can't be changed, that might be interrupted but not diverted or transformed? This has to do, Arendt thinks, with the with a couple of things. First, with the logic of deterrence, right? That the sorry, that because weapons are no longer about winning wars, but deterring wars, weapons now secure the whole world without ever having to be used. Right? We can never use the weapons that we have, because to use the weapons that we have would be to destroy the world. In other words, it is this world or no world is the logic of nuclear weapons. And so this gets us into what the point of weapons are to begin with. What are weapons? Arendt says weapons are implements of violence, but more precisely, violence, and I think this is a somewhat dubious claim, but it's her definition, so we'll work with this. Right? Violence is distinct from force, power, and strength because it requires an implement. Right? Violence requires a weapon. Violence requires a tool. And that sets violence apart from power, force, and strength. So you can have power without violence. You can have strength without violence. You can have force without violence. um, all of those things may look like violence, but they're different. Right? Being forceful is different from being violent. Violence, for Arendt, requires the use of an implement. Now, I think the reason why Arendt wants to insist on this, this violence, is this idea that violence requires an implement, is because for Arendt, implements are products of a world. A world is created in distinction from the earth or the planet. The world is man-made. And so a world has certain weapons. And you can have, therefore, because the world is man-made, is a cultural artifact, you can have a clash between worlds. Right? And a clash between worlds would mean a clash between the weapons of those worlds. So that violence as a product of weapons is a way for one world to dominate another world. It is, more importantly, a way of settling political differences. Right? The ultimate point of violence is historically to conquer an enemy or drive out an invading army. Violence has to do with political clash, political conquest, with war. And war is always between worlds. Right? And one of the main ways that a world can conquer another is by having more efficient, more effective implements of violence. So, the point of violence historically in the ancient world, in the medieval world, and through most of the modern world, really up until the 20th century, the point of violence, what violence did was, as she says, it was the final arbiter of international relations. Now, what happens when the implements of violence, when weapons, cannot be used? If they are used, it means the destruction of the entire world, of all worlds. Well, what happens is that it becomes much more difficult to imagine a different world than the one through which the nuclear bomb was invented, the world to which the nuclear bomb belongs. And so the nuclear bomb is not a weapon that is designed to be used in a war between worlds, between political states. Nuclear bomb is a weapon intended to prevent anyone from ever trying to challenge the world that created the nuclear bomb, right? It is uh, essentially saying there can be no war on this world uh, because the only alternative, if this world decides to fight for itself, will be no world, the destruction of the world. So, what is this world uh, to which the nuclear bomb belongs? It is, Arendt thinks, the world of science and technology, a world dominated by technologization and scientization, right? The scientization of everything. And above all, Arendt is worried about the scientization of politics. The idea that uh, politics is a question of scientific knowledge in any form, right? For Arendt, politics is, as I said at the beginning, about freedom, right? Uh, the realm of politics is the realm of free human action. Uh, and by definition, uh, free action cannot be predicted. Free action cannot be uh, observed ahead of time, right? Obviously. And so freedom, and hence politics, cannot be an object of scientific investigation. Right? There is no possibility for a science uh, of free action. In a technologized, scientized world, then, freedom becomes either impossible, and as I alluded to earlier, right, there are plenty of philosophers out there who would tell you there is no such thing as freedom anyway. Uh, but in this world, freedom is either impossible or a threat. Uh, if your freedom is used uh, to do anything that works against the world of the nuclear bomb, then it is itself a threat. Right? Uh, so this raises several other major problems, right? Uh, while any action against the world of the nuclear bomb would be a threat, uh, that threat is also absolutely neutralized by the existence of a nuclear bomb, right? By the existence, moreover, of uh, technological weapons, right? The weapons of a modern military. Uh, and this is I think Arendt is getting into territory. She'll get into it more explicitly in a minute, but um, when we think about, I'm thinking about the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, right? And this idea of overthrowing the U.S. government. Uh, what a strange idea, right? Um, what would it mean to overthrow the U.S. government? What would it mean uh, for there to be a revolution, an actual revolution? Um, what would you use to fight uh, a state like the United States, a nuclear state, a state that has, uh, you know, unmanned drones, chemical warfare technologies, etc. Right? All the weapons of modern technology, modern warfare. What would that revolution look like? Uh, any revolution that is not obliterated by those weapons of modern warfare, obliterated by a state that has the power to literally destroy the planet, is a revolution that was allowed to happen by the state, by the people, uh, for one reason or another. So the very possibility of revolution as uh, armed conflict between opposing political views is it's sort of impossible, right? It's moot. Um, there's no real opportunity for that fight. Uh, so this is a good example of the way in which the possibilities for violence and what violence means are fundamentally transformed by the tools of violence. So when Arendt says um, that violence always occurs in a means ends network or a means ends matrix, what she means is that violence is always a means to some end. Right? This is the definition of violence through history. Historically, violence has been a means to an end. Right? The American Revolution was a violent revolution, a means toward the end, which was sovereignty, autonomy, independence from the British Empire. uh, Violence is always a means to an end, and the implements of violence, weapons, are the means themselves. Right? So when we think about that in the context of the nuclear bomb and other, you know, forms of modern warfare, uh, Arendt thinks what has happened is that the means have overflowed the ends, that we have become obsessed with stockpiling and accumulating uh, the means of violence, implements of violence, uh, to such an extent that those means can never be used to reach any other end besides their own existence. Uh, that um, what we have is no longer a state uh, that has the weapons to pursue violently whatever end it desires, but instead a state whose end, whose goal is constantly increasing the means of doing violence. That is to say, the goal of politics is to endlessly create the weapons needed to uh, secure the state, not as it could be, uh, but as it is. Right? What we have is locked in. That's the meaning of violence in the context of the nuclear bomb. Um, I was thinking about this in terms also of guns in the United States, and thinking about what are guns for. Okay, yes, sure. I'll hear an argument about a gun being used to protect your home against an invader, an intruder, right? Um, we can have a separate discussion about that, hopefully, at some point, right? And all the statistics on that. Um, But sure, guns, protect yourself from an intruder. But then we think about the people that are stockpiling guns, right? People that own hundreds of guns, machine guns, bazooka, whatever. And you ask, what is the purpose of having all these guns? What are these guns for, right? You don't honestly think these guns are going to be able, no matter how many uh, M16s you have, right? With your, you know, what's it called? The bump stock. No matter how many of those you have, you're never going to even begin to overthrow the US military, right? It's preposterous. It's an idiotic idea. Uh, so why are you stockpiling all these guns? Um, and the answer you hear often is, well, I'm protecting myself from the government. What are you afraid the government's going to do? I'm afraid they're going to take my guns. Right? I have to have my guns in order to protect my guns. uh, right? If I didn't have guns, I wouldn't need guns. But because I have guns, I have to have guns. Um, that's the sort of logic, right? Uh, the means is the end. Right? I am only interested in owning the guns, and not having the guns is what I need the guns for. Anyway, I think you get my point. Uh, in both cases, what is being protected is the status quo, right? Uh, what's being guarded against is any kind of change. So, one of the major questions that Arendt's asking, I think, is how do we get out of this, right? How do we escape this? So let's read a little bit from pages 6 and 7. Um, Under these circumstances, speaking about the modern world, the technologized, scientized world, the nuclear bomb world, she writes, there are indeed few things that are more frightening than the steadily increasing prestige of scientifically minded brain trusters in the councils of government during the last decades. The trouble is not they're cold blooded enough to think the unthinkable, right, to drop the bomb, but that they do not think. So these scientifically minded brain trusters in the councils of government, according to Arendt, do not think. Instead of indulging in such an old fashioned, uncomputerizable activity, they reckon with the consequences of certain hypothetically assumed constellations without, however, being able to test their hypotheses against actual occurrences. The logical flaw in these hypothetical constructions of future events is always the same. What first appears as a hypothesis, with or without its implied alternatives, according to the level of sophistication, turns immediately, usually after a few paragraphs, into a fact, which then gives birth to a whole string of similar non facts, with the result that the purely speculative character of the whole enterprise is forgotten. And what Arendt is saying is that this, this world that is enforced by the bomb and to which the bomb belongs is a scientific world. And in order to reproduce this world that belongs to the bomb, uh, in order to maintain the status quo, the world has to be more and more thoroughly scientized and technologized, right? Brought into harmony with a technological world. Right? Now, why? Because, again, a world is a man made artifact. Uh, and a world has certain, right, what she's calling here, I think, constellations. It has a certain constellation. It has its weapons, it has its means of communication, etc. Right? And so because these technologically advanced weapons um, are a part of this technological world, and those technological weapons won't allow that world to be challenged. Uh, the only thing left to be done is to all the more thoroughly technologize the world, right? Turn everything into a science. But Arendt thinks this is the greatest danger of the age. This inability to understand that politics cannot be technologized, scientized, turned into a science, precisely because it is the realm of freedom, means that our politics are operating on false assumptions. They're acting as though society is an object of science, uh, and that everything that will happen in the political realm and in the future can be predicted if we only have a good enough science of society. Right. But if we believe that, if that is our approach, then we will always be uh, vulnerable to the unexpected, to the eruption of actual freedom within the political realm. Uh, I mean, so this is sort of um, we got an extremely stark example of this in the 2016 election, right, where every political scientist said there's no chance that Donald Trump is going to win, right? Hillary Clinton is a shoe-in. All the polls, which have the best science behind them, point that way. All prevailing political wisdom says someone like Trump can't be elected. That Hillary is going to be more acceptable in the final, in the voting booth. Uh, all of the modeling, all of the best uh, political scientists uh, made this prediction based on their informed technological and scientific view of society. And what happened was, right, this eruption of freedom. Uh, it was what Arendt here calls an event. Uh, on page 7, she writes, events, by definition, are occurrences that interrupt routine processes and routine procedures. Only in a world in which nothing of importance ever happens could the futurologist's dream come true. Right? Uh, Events are precisely those things that cannot be predicted, and there is no getting rid of events, of things happening, of freedom. Right? So, because this scientized world um, insists on, right, discovering some kind of program and procedure by which history unfolds, according to which the future might be roughly predicted. Uh, it it leaves itself all the more, um, unaware of the possibility of events, of real things happening and changing. And the enormous danger is that by not taking taking that into consideration, by having too much confidence in their assumptions, uh, they are toying with this ultimate violence, right? So, science, in this sense, is a terrible tool for politics. Uh, and the greatest danger to politics is attempting to think politics as science. Um, Now, since this is an ethics class and not a politics class, um, I think that the connection here for Arendt is going to be in freedom, right? That the danger of this worldview, the world of the bomb, is not just that through some miscalculation, um, unspeakable violence will be unleashed, but also that uh, by insisting that this one worldview, this 20th century world, be the only world possible, what happens is an enormous decrease in human freedom, a alienation of the human being from their proper being, uh, which is a free being, right? Able to choose. By threatening such violence, if the reigning world is challenged or goes to war with another world or another political uh, bloc, what we have is a narrowing of possible human experience, a narrowing of possible worlds, a narrowing of what can be created, what can be imagined, and what can be done. Uh, and that is, for Arendt, uh, a matter of enormous ethical significance, right? Um, as because politics, right, politics as uh, to the extent that politics is about securing freedom, it is about uh, creating an ethical world. So, the other danger of these weapons is the confusion of violence, power, and force, and the belief that uh, having instruments of violence is the same as having power, or the same as being forceful. But in fact, right, just because one has implements of violence, doesn't mean that one has power. Uh, and so we then see another problem, which is the separation between the instruments of mass violence and the seat of power. So we can see that uh, simply because you're able to do violence to someone, uh, or another country, doesn't mean that you have the ability to hold power over them. Right? This is the sort of ultimate problem with violence, and an important distinction between violence and power. Right? So you can think about torture. Uh, you can torture someone's body, right? And they can't do any violence back to you. But just having the ability to torture someone doesn't give you power over them. Right? The people who are able to undergo torture without, giving information to the torturer, right? The person being tortured uh, is actually the one holding the power, and that is one of the major flaws with violence. Right? That violence is not a means to power necessarily. And so, what we can imagine then is this absolute divorce between the implements of violence and the seat of power, where someone who is not in power would be able to destroy power through mere violence, right? Potentially. or in any case, this disconnect causes all kinds of dangerous possible situations. Right? We can think about the Vietnam War as a perfect example. Right? The Vietnam War, uh, the United States, had uh, much more sophisticated and developed weapons, military, uh, anything technological, an advantage when it came to anything technological. But uh, obviously, that wasn't enough to win that war, right? And so, where uh, violence is able to exist in the absence of power, what you get is this sort of meaningless uh, and, at this point, sort of, for Arendt, non-political violence. Uh, yeah. So let's jump ahead a little bit to uh, page 13 and 14, where she's talking about violence not in the context of geopolitics or the state, but violence through protest, right? Where she's talking about the Black Power movement, the anti war protest, and the other new left movements in the 60s and 70s. She's talking about uh, the way violence operates in those movements. uh, now, why, she thinks, or she asks, why are these new left radicals, uh, why are these new left movements in the 70s uh, so interested in violence? Why do they see violence as a means to their end? She speculates, for one thing, these kids, right, because they were largely kids, grew up in a world of extreme political violence, where violence was viewed as a kind of alternative to power, right, where violence could supplement power or even substitute for power, right? Uh, and she gives the example of the atom bomb, but then also, right, mentions that these kids in high school would have learned about concentration and extermination camps in Nazi Germany, about genocide and torture, and the wholesale slaughter of civilians in war, without which modern military operations are no longer possible, even if restricted to conventional weapons. The idea that violence can be reserved for uh, strictly military or strictly political operations in the sense of war uh, has been lost. I think this is an actually a really important point, right? That with World War II, and you could probably make the same argument about World War One, certainly, and probably wars in the 19th century also, but really starkly in World War II, uh, that the old rules about war and violence, um, to the extent that they were ever followed, were really thrown out the window. Um, and those rules would be the Augustinian rules, like the rules drawn up by St. Augustine for Christian conduct in war. Right? The most prominent of those would be um, right, that violence is only defensible in cases of self-defense. That only, right, enemy soldiers should be fought. Only someone who is actively threatening your life. So that in an Augustinian model, war between armies is legitimate because an army is actively threatening your life, um, and it's legitimate to do violence to another soldier because that soldier would do violence to you. It is not permitted, however, to do violence against civilians. It's certainly not permitted to exterminate through gas chambers and other forms of mass murder entire peoples, right, through genocide, etc. So the observation that violence has overspilled the boundaries of traditional warfare, that violence is not contained to armies, right? That modern warfare necessarily involves uh, murdering citizens, right? Death of innocents, of non-combatants, um, of women and children, etc. That violence no longer has a sort of set place in the world. Um, it's diffuse. So, having seen the way that violence overspills those traditional, the traditional place for it in politics and global affairs, they see violence as, uh, they see the political state as illegitimate, using violence illegitimately, which would legitimize, other kinds of violence against the state, um, but also that violence becomes identical to power, right? And that if you want power, you want to change power, if you want to change what power does, you have to use violence. So violence becomes synonymous with political power in some sense, uh, despite the fact that, right, obviously, a violent overthrow of the U.S. government is ridiculous, or of any government, any modern technologized state. Uh, so Arendt then goes on to give a little analysis of these movements, uh, and what she says is sort of interesting and sort of strange, I think. First, she thinks that the use of violence is non-political. This is one of Arendt's most important points. Violence, properly speaking, is not political, and that the attempt to change policy through violence is a non-political attempt to change the political. By using violence to protest the government, right, one is not engaged in politics, but only in this futile war against a nuclear armed state. Right? War is not politics for Arendt. So by using violent rhetoric, by being violent, and there were certainly cases of violence, especially arson, uh, in these New Left movements. By using violence, they have fundamentally missed um, the opportunity to have a political challenge. By resorting to violence, they have discredited their own political argument, right? Uh, a political argument is based in persuasion, not in violence. So there is a kind of perversion of the political in these movements. And she thinks that this is in part about the emotionality of the movement. And this is an interesting point, that for Arendt, the failure of those movements was that they were based in, again, not persuasion and argument, but emotion and moral sentiment. Right. Uh, the reason why they weren't taken seriously, uh, or it was many sort of establishment figures found it easy to dismiss them, uh, is the same reason that they would resort to violence. That it wasn't political, it was emotional. And when one acts emotionally, one is not acting freely, right? One is being controlled by one's emotions, and therefore one is not acting politically. So the failure, she thinks, has to do with the fact that it's an emotional protest. Uh, I think this is an interesting point. I think there's some validity to that. Now, she goes on to say some strange things, or things that strike us as strange, I think, in 2021. Uh, for example, she'll say that the Black Power movement on college campuses is demanding that academic standards be lowered. Uh, she doesn't go that deeply into it, so I don't want to ascribe some position to her that is not right. But I think we can entertain the idea that uh, emotional demands um, may not have practical policy applications, implementations. Um, but I also just want to flag that I think Arendt is going a little bit easy on the university and being a little credulous uh, of the institution of the university and the academy in the United States. That in this case, uh, things are, and I think this is a point against this argument about moral sentiment and emotion in general, that things are so complicated uh, that while it's certainly true, a thought out and rational argument is going to be politically more effective than an emotional, uh, violent outburst. That complexity is so complex, so difficult to overcome, uh, that the emotionality has to be considered as part of uh, the political whole. Now that's not Arendt's point. Um, for her, emotionality is an illegitimate political ground or argument. However, she'll also then go on to say, right, that these uh, the violence in these movements was not simply a consequence of the emotionality of the protesters, but that where violence broke out, it was often as a result of clashes with the police, right? Where violence was used against the protesters, uh, where peaceful demonstrations were violently broken up. Um, and that was the beginning of it. Right? Mm. In America, the student movement has been seriously radicalized wherever police and police brutality intervened in essentially nonviolent demonstrations, occupations of administration buildings, sit-ins, etc. Serious violence entered the scene only with the appearance of the Black Power movement on the campuses. And so the violence of these movements was emotional, but it was not strictly the emotion of the protesters, but the emotionality also coming from the police, right? All right. Interestingly, here she also notes the way that the relation to violence splintered uh, the Black Power movement from the workers' movement, right? That the uh, what she views as, so this is a sort of complicated point, um, but for Arendt, right, uh, there was more actual violence in the Black Power movement than there was in the workers' movement. I don't have the statistics or a good enough knowledge of that history to know if that's correct. But I trust Arendt on this. I think that's, who knows? I actually don't know if I trust her on that. But so let's say her point is at least that the violent rhetoric of the Black Power movement was taken much more seriously and responded to as a real threat than the violent rhetoric of, for example, white student movements against the Vietnam War. Right? Both groups used violent rhetoric, but only the Black Power movement was treated as a true violent threat and was responded to with similar violence. Um, Now, I think for now, all I want to say about that is um, that it's interesting that violence is one of the wedges that divided uh, movements that had a common enemy, right? More or less. Uh, there was a lot of common ground between the anti war movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and the workers' movement. Right? And one of the things that separated the Black Power movement from the other more predominantly white movements was the role of violence and the possibility or the perceived possibility of violence. Um, yeah. So, can violence be used to bring about progress? Is there the possibility that violent resistance can bring about progress? This is how Arendt ends the first section of this book with a discussion of progress. Uh, and I think this is an interesting point. Progress has never been conceived as a product of violence. Uh, Progress, as Arendt says, began as the idea of uh, the education of humanity. Right? Progress is a kind of enlightenment idea that through human history we accumulate knowledge and develop better and better knowledge, better and better systems, better and better technology, etc. Progress is the work of all of human history. In the 18th and 19th century, in the 19th century, progress becomes less about uh, continual development of knowledge as it was in the 17th century when there were still lots of major scientific breakthroughs, etc. In the 19th century, progress becomes about uh, instead universal education. No longer is it the case that human beings are making progress on knowledge. Now, progress means educating all human beings about what we already know. And then finally, progress becomes uh, not simply about education, but about social conditions, social arrangements, right? About developing, uh, getting clean drinking water, getting electricity to all people, right? About delivering the modern way of life to as much of the world as possible. So progress is no longer about continual and further development, but instead about bringing everyone up to the same technological level, essentially. Um, there's another idea of progress that is very important to Arendt, and which she talks about throughout this section, which is the Marxist idea of progress. And the Marxist idea of progress is a movement toward a just society, right? A society of peace and equality. Right? For Marx, all human history is developing toward what he called a classless society, right? A society of equals. But, as Arendt points out several times here, that development and that progress for Marx was never brought about by violence, right? It wasn't that people chose revolution and through that brought about a better world or the next stage on the path toward classless society. For Marx, history progresses according to the logic of history itself. Right, the development of history is necessary uh, and is not free. Right? Arendt uses this to, in the first place, argue that the socialists of the '60s, the communists of the '60s, weren't really Marxists because they believed you could bring about, uh, you know, social progress through violence. Right? Marx would disagree, and she says um, this is what the discussion about Sartre and Fanon is also. Right? She's arguing against this sort of strain of Marxists in the '60s that believed historical progress in the Marxist sense could be brought about through violence. She's saying, no, that's not Marxism, and that doesn't make sense in Marx's plan, right? Marx's idea. Um, so, a challenge to the idea that violence brings about progress, uh, but also a kind of um, condemnation of the idea of progress itself, right? Because this idea of progress, whether we view it as uh, in the Marxist sense or in a more Enlightenment sense, or um, above all, we view it in the sense most common to the 20th century, which has to do with scientific and technological progress, then progress is itself one of the ways that human freedom, human spontaneity, and history get narrowed, get closed off, and where possibilities become closed off. Right? To say that we're interested in progress is again to affirm that there is some necessary plan or program uh, which history is following, which politics must follow. To know toward what we're progressing is to uh, limit political possibilities, human possibilities, to only those that move toward uh, this predestined end goal, right? Uh, to talk about progress is to rely on one of those false assumptions that she began the book talking about. Right? We assume that we are moving necessarily toward uh, a more democratic society, and therefore, uh, right, people will always vote XYZ way. We assume that we are uh, moving toward a more peaceful society, and therefore we don't really need to worry about these nuclear bombs anymore. Right? Um, all such assumptions are dangerous. Aren't things. So, I think that will conclude our discussion of the first part of On Violence, and we'll pick up with part two next.